Good evening. Welcome to the Vancouver Aquarium's program tonight, Arctic Sea Ice, a slippery slope. The Arctic is a fragile, beautiful place that most people know very little about. The Arctic is also in the grip of unprecedented change that will have consequences reaching far beyond its icy shores. To hear about some of these changes, we will hear from three different experts. Dr. David Barber, Director of the Center for Earth Observation Science and Associate Dean of Research, the Faculty of Environment at the University of Manitoba, whose research focuses on the geophysics of snow and sea ice. Mr. Eric Solomon, Director of Arctic Programs at the Vancouver Aquarium Marine Science Center, leads the aquarium's Arctic research, conservation, and education initiatives, and works with Arctic Aboriginal communities, researchers, policymakers, educators, and the general public. And Dr. Valeria Vergara, Research Associate at the Vancouver Aquarium, whose research aims to understand the effects of increasing underwater noise in the Arctic on animal communication and behavior. Our program tonight is supported by the Science in Canada's North Café Scientifique series, and we would like to acknowledge the support of the W. Garfield Weston Foundation and the Canadian Association of Science Centers for their support. Dr. Dave Barber.
Thank you. You can hear me okay? They tell me I can't walk around. I have to stand beside the computer because they're webcasting, so I'll stand here. I started working in the Arctic in 1981, and I've been working there ever since. I'm a specialist in sea ice and what happens with sea ice when it forms, how it moves, what the consequences of that change in variability are on sea ice. I work here at the University of Manitoba, and you would wonder, why does the University of Manitoba have an Arctic marine program? I mean, we're right in the middle of the continent. It's full of wheat fields and canola fields. But a lot of people forget that we're actually a marine province. In the northern part of our province, we have the only deep water port in the Arctic, which is Churchill. We have one of the world's largest beluga populations on the west coast of Hudson Bay. And of course, if you know about Churchill, you know about polar bears and what happens with polar bears in Hudson Bay. So Manitoba is actually a very Arctic-centric province and has a lot of interconnection with the north, immediately north of our province. I went to the University of Manitoba in 1993. They had no Arctic program at the time, but I had a lot of background in Arctic research. I did my PhD at the University of Waterloo, and I started a research program that now has 135 people in it. Everybody works on sea ice. So there's about 18 faculty members, there's 9 or 10 research associates, there's a number of adjunct professors, we have about 60 graduate students, a number of postdoctoral fellows, and what's unique about it is that everybody works on some aspect of sea ice, whether it's about geochemistry of sea ice, whether it's how larger or higher trophic levels respond to it, primary production, aspects of the chemistry of the system, through to how contaminants move through the system, whether it's mercury or persistent organic pollutants. And we work all over the Arctic. My lab merged with the Greenland Climate Research Center in Nuuk, Greenland, which merged with the University of Aarhus in Denmark, forming something called the Arctic Science Partnership, which is about 350 investigators that were totally linked. Our PhD students move back and forth between the different centers. We have joint faculty members between each of the areas. And we work in the both the Pacific and Atlantic sectors of the Arctic, with Greenland and Canada forming sort of natural boundaries to where we do our science. We're heavily invested in the research icebreaker Amundsen. University of Laval and Manitoba are the two universities that receive funding for that vessel and how we use that vessel for research. If you look on the back of your $50 bill, you'll see a picture of that research vessel. It's really increased our capability to access the Arctic throughout seasons that we historically have been unable to do, and to move into areas that we couldn't before. So our research groups here in Canada are the only ones to have ever overwintered a fully outfitted icebreaker in the high Arctic and kept it mobile through the winter season. That was during the International Polar Year. So we have a lot of expertise and experience in how to navigate and how to work in the high Arctic in all seasons. What we do is we focus on this animation that you're going to see on the left. This is an animation of passive microwave satellite data. And the minimum extent that you see is when that ice shrinks down in the summertime. So in the media, you'll hear a lot about the summer minimum extent of sea ice. Then the ice grows out the next winter. You'll see export pathways in the sea ice coming out through Fram Strait, down through Nares Strait here, through the archipelago. You'll see the minimum extent in summer is reflected on this graph on this side. So we've been tracking this ice since 1978, and the minimum extent when I first started working in the Arctic was over here. So it was not that variable, and it was up at around 7.5 million square kilometers. And it has been dropping precipitously ever since. You've heard of this in the media for many years, that we're losing this sea ice. To give you an idea of the context of what this loss is, the average loss along that line that you're seeing here of the summer minimum extent of sea ice is an area of 70,000 square kilometers per year. If you've ever drove along Lake Superior is about 70,000 square kilometers in size. So we're losing about that amount of multi-year sea ice each year and have been doing so for the past 30 years. This is really leading to something called a multi-year to a first-year transition in the Arctic. So when I first started working in the Arctic, about 85% of the Arctic basin was covered with this multi-year sea ice. Multi-year sea ice is about as thick as this ceiling right where I am. That's the thickness of multi-year sea ice. First-year sea ice is about as thick as me, not thick this way, but thick this way. And so it's about 2 meters thick. And first-year ice is very soft, very pliable. It's a much different beast than multi-year ice is. Multi-year ice is much fresher, much less salinity in it, and much harder, and the thickness to the ceiling. So it's a totally different thing. Now, how significant is this change that we see along this axis? Well, we've done a lot of research on that over the years, and we're very convinced scientifically that the changes we're seeing in the high Arctic sea ice is significant over at least the last 1,450 years, which takes us well past the Industrial Revolution and is very much related to hydrocarbon development and CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's very much a byproduct of global warming. It's not a surprise. We went to the Arctic in the first place 30 years ago to see this effect. The models at the time predicted this is what we would see, and in fact, this is what we're seeing. There are some complexities in it, but the average is that this is what we're seeing. Now that summer minimum extent, we've often thought that this was a fall phenomenon, so that what happens here is that the ice, there's less of it each late summer, so the minimum extent happens usually around the 3rd or 4th week of September. And this minimum extent, which is represented by all these dots, we used to think of as a fall phenomenon, so that the falls were getting later and later. It was taking longer and longer to form the sea ice. We overwintered in 2007, 2008 in the high Arctic, and we started seeing a lot of open water in this period. This was one of the first strong minimums we had in 2007, which was this one over here. And we started to think, well, is this open water also occurring in the other seasons? Like, is it extending into December, January, February? So we just finished a paper on that, and I'd just like to show you some of the results. So this is open water fraction on this axis here, and this is the beginning of the time series that I was showing before. So this is 1980, and you can see that this is the open water fraction in September. So the amount of open water is increasing as we go through the time series. It's a significant relationship, and it's happening in the month of September over that time period. Not surprising, this is what we would expect to find because the fall is when most of this phenomenon is happening. October looks like this, which was a bit surprising, but still kind of in line with what we expected with this late fall formation of sea ice. This is what November looks like, which started to become surprising because in the high Arctic you have no sunlight by November, so things should be starting to freeze over quite consistently by then, but there's still an increasing trend towards open water in the month of November. This is what December looks like, which was very surprising. This is what January looks like, which now became a concern because this shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't be seeing so much open water in the winter. This is what February looks like, March, April, May, June, July, right through the annual cycle. And so the take-home message for this thing is we're not losing sea ice just in the fall anymore, and we haven't been for a while. We just didn't really pay attention to it. We are losing ice in the middle of winter as well. Now the question becomes is where are we losing this ice? The Arctic is a big place, so we need to map this these trajectories. So now what I'm going to show you is a map of this red trend line. I'm just going to measure the slope of that line, then I'm going to plot it back into a geographic frame so you can see where those trends are stronger and weaker, and I'll explain to you what's going on in each of those areas. So this is what the map looks like for the month of September. The trend lines are mapped here in these colors, so these are all trends showing an increase in open water fraction, and this is all in the Pacific sector of the Arctic. So you're looking at Alaska here, Russia, here's Greenland, the Russian coastline here. So this open water that you see here, this trend towards more open water in September, is primarily happening in the Pacific sector, or the Beaufort Sea, which is to be expected. What happens there is the ice, it melts out in the summer, then you have an open ocean and you still have sunlight. So the sunlight enters the upper part of the ocean, warms that surface of the ocean, then you have to get rid of all that heat before you can form the sea ice again in the fall. This is to be expected, and we've known about this for quite a long time. When you go to, I got a lot of buttons here to push. When you go to October, it's still the same phenomenon, mostly limited to the Pacific sector. Then you get out to November and you can see that the change is no longer in the Pacific sector because now this sector has started to freeze over. You'll see that this trend is starting to occur here. We particularly see this in Baffin Bay and northern Hudson Bay, and you've heard of this story with the Hudson Bay polar bears. The ice is not forming until much later, so the bears have to stay on the shore much longer. They're running into risk of not enough food because they have to fast over the summer, and there's problems with starvation of some of these bears. And this is what this trend is showing you in the sea ice. When you move into December, it's the same kind of thing, but you'll see the trends are moving south. But you'll notice that something unusual is happening up here. Now this is in the high Arctic. This is a higher latitude, much less sun available there, much colder as a general rule, yet we're seeing a trend towards open water in December. This was surprising to us. We didn't expect to find this. You then move into January, the same thing is here. It's still occurring along this sector. The Atlantic sector of the Arctic seems to be producing less ice in the wintertime than it has historically. So the trend is towards open water. You continue on this trend into February, March. I mean, this is the coldest part of the Arctic. Air temperature should be around -40, -50. You should be forming sea ice all over the Arctic. Historically, we were. We started to look at this, and what's actually happening is the Gulf Stream is penetrating further up into this area, and it's upwelling underneath the sea ice. And so the Atlantic layer is much warmer, and as soon as you put that warm Atlantic layer up underneath the sea ice, you melt the sea ice very rapidly because there's so much heat energy in that Atlantic layer. And this is a phenomenon that we've been studying now for the last several years. This whole sector of the Arctic is starting to become a very interesting place because we're having large expanses of open water in winter, and we're starting to get biology functioning in that area in winter. And so there's lots of research going on there, both with our ASP partnership and with the Norwegians. This was a big surprise to us in this winter season. This continues into April, May, which is all Atlantic driven because there's not enough light really to start doing anything to the surface of the sea ice, so most of this melting is happening from underneath. And then you get into June, and now you're starting to see the southern latitudes starting to open up, and that's an atmospherically driven change to the sea ice. You go into July, you'll see it starts to creep back into the Pacific sector, which is again driven by the atmosphere. And you go into August, and it's back to the pattern that you see in September. So we're starting to understand a lot about what's going on with the sea ice, why it's changing, and the rates at which it's changing. And we understand that over a variety of different space and time scales. And this has been this research has been the product of about 20 years of working in the Arctic. I want to finish off my talk by just telling you very briefly about 7 surprises. When I tell you we have 135 people working at our lab, all working on sea ice, there's many journal papers of many different things that are all somewhat interesting to people, to the general public, and others that aren't. I'm going to try to synthesize just 7 points that I think are important for the public to understand and for other scientists to understand. So the first of these is that we're getting a lot of thin ice in the Arctic now. So this is thin ice that you see here in front of you. That's thicker ice behind it, thicker ice in front. This is a lead that is opened up in the ice, and these little white patches on there are something called frost flowers. Frost flowers look like this. They're a very delicate, fragile, crystalline structure that forms when the sea ice forms. It pushes salts both upwards and downwards because the ice is growing. It's pushing the salts out either side. The salts that come up into the atmosphere form these crystalline features. The stuff that goes into the ocean causes the ocean layer to sink, and it sinks down towards the bottom, and that forms what's called bottom water. It's a main process in the Arctic called thermohaline convection. These salt flowers are extremely reactive with the atmosphere. We haven't understood this until the last few years. They're very reactive in the form of bromine, which is associated with ozone holes that are developing in the Arctic, and they're very important in mercury exchange. You would have thought that mercury would have disappeared in the Arctic. Well, it hasn't disappeared in the Arctic because it's now being liberated from sources that it used to be trapped in a frozen state. Because those frozen states are melting, that mercury is being uptaken into the system, and we're actually seeing it throughout the system. The other thing that this young ice has in it, which we just discovered recently, is an element called icaite. Icaite is a mineral, and that mineral is associated with the carbonate chemistry of sea ice. So there's salts in the sea ice from the ocean water, and these icaite crystals are part of that carbonate chemistry in the ice. And they're capable of sequestering CO2 from the atmosphere, taking it into these crystals, and then they actually circulate inside the sea ice. We used to think of the sea ice as a cap over top of the ocean, that it would limit exchange from the ocean to the atmosphere. It's not the case. It's actively working like a pump because there's temperature variations in the atmosphere that cause the temperature in the ice to change, which sets up convection cells of heat in the ice. And these icaite crystals actually play a role in the sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere, even in the winter, into the sea ice, and then ultimately to the bottom of the sea ice where algae takes up that carbon and makes use of it. So we don't even understand whether the Arctic is going to become an overall source or a sink for CO2 because we didn't understand this until 3 years ago. So it's just brand new information. The second thing that is surprising to us is snow on sea ice. And this you would think would be a simple thing, right? We're all quite familiar with snow. I live in Winnipeg where we get quite a bit of snow, and you think we would understand it, but we really don't understand it very well. And the reason is that if the snow falls you have two pulses of snow, storms that you get in the Arctic, same as you get in Canada. You get a fall pulse and a spring pulse of snowstorms. If that fall pulse, if that snow falls in the open water, it does nothing. If it falls on sea ice, that sea ice must have survived that fall, so it must be multi-year sea ice by definition, and that snow will form a very thick insulating blanket over that multi-year sea ice. When it insulates that sea ice, it doesn't allow that multi-year sea ice to grow because it's insulating it from the cold atmosphere. The ocean is warm, remember? So this thick snow does that. When we overwintered, we were going out onto multi-year sea ice in December with our helicopter off the Amundsen, trying to land on a surface, and we couldn't because the helicopter would cause a whiteout with such thick snow covers on these multi-year surfaces that we couldn't land the helicopter on it. And what this is doing is it's protecting the multi-year sea ice from growing. So therefore, the next summer, it's easier to melt it out. So it's a feedback mechanism into melting that multi-year sea ice even faster than it would have otherwise. The other thing that snow does is it produces a habitat for organisms, particularly the higher trophic levels in the system. You will have heard in the media a lot that sea ice is declining, so therefore polar bear habitat is declining. That is a gross oversimplification. Some places polar bear habitat is improving. Other places it's getting worse. Other places it's staying stable. And the reason for that is polar bears don't use multi-year sea ice. So we started out with an Arctic where we have 85% multi-year sea ice, and we've transitioned to one where we have now 13% multi-year sea ice. All that other percentage is now first-year sea ice, which is the preferred habitat of ring seals and the preferred habitat of polar bears. So depending on where you are, you can see an improvement in polar bear habitat. Other places, the open water season is too long, which causes big problems for the bears, like Hudson Bay. So therefore, this sort of theory of the one brush paints everything comes across in the media. It's not true. Some places, polar bear habitat is actually improving. The other thing that we're realizing about sea ice is that a good analog for it is to think of sea ice like a tropical rainforest. Now this will sound a bit odd to you because, when you think about tropical rainforest, you think about, well, if we go into a tropical rainforest and we cut down all these trees, we're going to affect the ecosystem, right? That's very well known. Everybody understands that because the ecosystem does what? Those trees do what? They control light and they control heat. That's what a tropical rainforest does. That's exactly what sea ice does. It controls light and it controls heat. Because it controls those two things, it really controls the marine ecosystem. It is the main determining factor. And we've looked at this for many years now. The marine ecosystem is a simple one, simple in the sense that there aren't a lot of alternates that you can go to for different trophic relationships in that. But it's extremely sensitive to what goes on with that physical system. So to give you an idea of just how complex it is, if we talk about snow on this surface, the algae that forms on the base of this surface has evolved to take advantage of either something more than 5 centimeters of snow on sea ice or less than 20 centimeters of snow on sea ice. If you do that, the algae thrives, does quite well. If you have less than 5 centimeters of snow, you get too much light into it, and the algae just burns off. If you have more than 20 centimeters of snow cover, you don't get enough light, and the algae starves. And of course, if the algae is not doing well, everything else in the trophic system doesn't do well. And that's the problem with the Arctic marine ecosystem, is there's not many alternative trophic pathways to get energy when you're moving up through that system. That's what causes the Arctic marine system to be so sensitive to changes in this. We've published many papers on this, and we've not found anything in this system that is not affected by sea ice. The entire system is changing, and is changing very rapidly, including invasive species in many different parts of the Arctic. And the reason that invasive species do so well is they can displace one of these trophic relationships and come in and just outcompete everybody else, because it's more now like the North Pacific or more like the North Atlantic. And it's happening all over the Arctic. The next one is what you see is not necessarily what you get. So this was a paper we did a few years ago where we were going into the southern Beaufort Sea. We were planning to study the remnants of multi-year sea ice. So these red colors up here are supposed to be multi-year sea ice. That is this stuff that's as thick as this ceiling, and we were supposed to be going there to study the remnants of it because we realized that it's disappearing, and we wanted to take an opportunity to look at this late season multi-year sea ice. We were taking the Amundsen down this line here, and we had a sample station here, and we're continuing this way. After this sample station, I went to bed. The ship operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We run it all the time with shifts. When I go as chief scientist, so I'm responsible for the scientific operations on board the ship. I went to sleep here at about 11 o'clock at night. The captain also went to sleep, told the first officer to just make as best time as you can, and we figured we'd wake up somewhere here inside this multi-year pack ice, and then we'd start operations the next day. I woke up about 3 o'clock in the morning, and the GPS panel on my screen in my bedroom showed that we were somewhere up around here by 3 in the morning, and we were doing 13 knots. Now the ship does 13.5 knots in open water, and we're doing 13 knots in what should be multi-year sea ice. And so I was very nervous, because if we hit multi-year sea ice at that speed, we could damage the ship. So I went up to the bridge and asked the first mate what the hell he was doing. And he said, "Oh, I'm just making good down this line. That's what the captain told me to do, and there's ice out there, but it's no barrier to the ship, so I'm going along at 13 knots. We couldn't really see all that well because it was late fall. As the light started to come back, I realized that what we were in was not multi-year sea ice. It was the leftover remnants of multi-year sea ice that had decayed to such an extent that all that was left was hummock pieces. Hummock pieces through the season. The hummocks are these round sort of surface topography, looks like this, and then a melt pond down here that gets the water in it. And then they drain right through in those areas, and then all that's left is this little piece in the middle. And that's called heavily decayed multi-year sea ice. And what was happening in this area was that we had these little pieces of ice. They're about the size of a Volkswagen. And then in between them, there was first-year ice starting to grow. And that first-year ice was about a centimeter thick. It just wasn't enough wind, and so therefore it was kind of at that level. And I thought, well, this is very unusual, because the satellites are seeing this as multi-year sea ice, and it obviously isn't. It's something that the ship can go through at full speed. So I thought, well, let's just keep going north. And we kept going north most of that day, got up to about here, and it was all that same kind of ice. And I thought, well, we have to go find where the actual multi-year sea ice is, and I know that it should be over this way somewhere, because this is the Canadian archipelago coast, and it tends to pile up against that coast. So we continued up. I started to veer in, and we still couldn't find this multi-year sea ice. It was still this rotten ice that had been going through. So I thought, well, to heck with this, let's go straight towards the coast. So we went straight in towards the coast, and we finally found the multi-year sea ice right here. And it was all classified as multi-year sea ice, but we were just on the inside edge of it here. And so we drove the ship in. We found a piece of ice that was about, so you can imagine a piece of multi-year sea ice this thick, about the size of Manhattan. So we parked the ship against it, and what we do in the summer to get scientists on board these kinds of ice is we pin the ship with large mooring cables. We drill holes in the ice, and we put in posts, and we put ropes over top of them. And then we put the gangplank out, and we let people get onto the ice, and everybody does their sampling, and we pull everybody back on the ship, and we continue on. So I'm sitting on the back deck of the ship, and I'm with a colleague of mine from the Bedford Institute of Oceanography in Halifax, and we're looking out, and Simon says, "Dave, did you see that? It looks like that floe moved." Now, you can't move a piece of multi-year sea ice that's the size of Manhattan. It doesn't move. It's huge. The thing is gigantic. I said, "Nah, Simon, it can't be. It can't be moving at all. It must have been in your eyes, right?" I said, "No, just sit here and look." So we sat and looked together, and sure enough, you could see the floe just start to move a little bit. As we watched, literally, in about 3.5 minutes, the entire floe broke up. And it broke up into pieces that were 100 meters in size. And we thought something really bizarre had happened. We thought there had been a tsunami somewhere, an earthquake or something, that had generated some kind of major force on this ice that broke it up catastrophically. Had we put 40 scientists on that ice, it would have been a catastrophe. We would have had people in the water all over the place, and these things are slamming together. There would have been deaths for sure. So we were very fortunate that Simon saw this, and we were able to avoid it. We then did an analysis of what actually happened. And what happened was there was a storm in the southern Beaufort Sea 3 days before this, and the waves were coming in this way into the ice. Because this ice was so weak, it was no barrier to those waves. Those waves were able to penetrate all the way in, and they penetrated 650 miles inside the ice edge. And when they arrived at this multi-year flow, the flow just rose up over the waves, and as it's coming down one side of the wave, it just cracked. And then it rose over the other one, it cracked, rose over the other one, cracked, rose over the other one, cracked. So the interdistance of the waves was 100 meters, and that's where the pieces of ice that were left afterwards. Now, we happened to be there with a fully outfitted science vessel with all kinds of equipment that we could measure all this, including GPS positioning information. So we were the first ones to document a feature where the marginal ice zone and waves and storms will influence the pack ice in the high Arctic. It was the first observation of that ever happening. This happens in the Antarctic, and we understand it quite well in the Antarctic, but it's because the ocean there impinges on the outside of the ice. We're surrounded by a continent here, whereas in the Antarctic, the continent's in the middle. So it was a very fascinating feature and really helped us understand how volatile the changes can be and how quickly they can happen in the high Arctic. How do I turn this down? One of the other features I'd like to show you is something that has not occurred in the southern Beaufort Sea. You see this thing here? It's an ice island. It's a piece of glacial ice that is broken off of an ice tongue from Ellesmere Island. The ice tongue is a glacier that's on land, and the ice comes out over top of the ocean. These used to be protected by sea ice. So the sea ice was always there, so you couldn't get these wave fetches that were coming in that broke up that multi-year sea ice that I showed you. This thing is 175 meters thick, and you can't do anything with it. If a drill ship is in the way, it just wipes out the drill ship. If you have an icebreaker, you just break the icebreaker. It's just not, they're just way too big to do anything with. We tagged 27 of these in the southern Beaufort Sea, all of them in size from sort of a 0.5 kilometer to 3 kilometers in size, all of them from 150 meters to 250 meters thick. It's all freshwater glacial ice. And what's happening is these ice edges, these ice shelves are breaking off, and they're being entrained into the sea ice, and then they're getting into the Beaufort Sea and moving around. The same thing is happening in the Greenland areas and the marginal ice zones that surround Greenland. There are large pieces of ice islands coming off there as well. This is a big hazard for any kind of operations inside Arctic marine areas because these things are moving more quickly than they were before, and the winds are getting stronger than they were before. The other thing that we found is that multi-year sea ice in certain conditions is actually getting thicker. So this is not a photoshopped picture. This keel or sail on this thing is about 3 meters high, and this sail is 3 meters high, and this keel on this multi-year sea ice is 30 meters deep. And so it's much thicker than normal multi-year sea ice. And what's happening is the ice, because it's moving so quickly, it tends to pile up on itself. And it piles up on itself, survives the summer, then the next year, some comes around again, piles up again, and it just makes it thicker and thicker and thicker. So what's happening, in fact, that as we decrease the amount of sea ice in the Arctic, we're actually increasing the amount of ice hazards, which is totally counterintuitive. And this is kind of an important thing if you're going to start doing drilling for oil and things like that in the Arctic, or increase shipping in the Arctic, for instance. The last one I want to show you is this teleconnection between the Arctic and climate in the southern parts of our planet. This is a complex story, but I just want to give you kind of the Reader's Digest version. When I started working in the Arctic, the polar vortex looked like this. The polar vortex is a pressure pattern that exists over the Arctic. It's generated by the fact that the Arctic is very cold, there's no sunlight there, and we used to cap that surface with sea ice, limiting the exchange of heat from the ocean into the atmosphere. So the polar vortex would set up as a pressure system over top of the pole, and it would maintain the cold air inside this polar vortex. Now, when you look on CBC or CTV or somebody's giving you a briefing on the weather forecast, they'll talk about the jet stream. The jet stream is the outer side of this polar vortex. So the position of that is what people call the jet stream. And the jet stream drags along weather with it. So patterns, weather patterns, get dragged along by this vortex that is moving around the planet. This vortex used to move quite quickly. The outside edge of this thing would drag weather systems along with it quite quickly, and that would lead to storm patterns that would traditionally occur over certain latitudes of the planet, which is what we have historically thought of as how the weather would evolve and be connected to the Arctic. This is now what the polar vortex looks like, and it's not just this particular year, but it is happening regularly and has been happening regularly for the last 10 years. What's happening is you're getting lobes on it. And these lobes, when these lobes come down over continental US, for instance, this is Florida right here, so this is where it dips deep down over top of North America. This is when you get very cold climates where you go to holiday in the south. You're going down to Texas or you're going down to Florida and they're getting really cold winters. This is generated from that. On the leeward side of this is a trough that is bringing warm air up over top of where you guys live here. So last year when you had all this warm weather that was coming up through the winter that was very dry, it was generated because of these lobes that are associated with this polar vortex. So on one side you get a southerly flow which is very warm. On the other side you get a northerly flow which is very cold. The other thing that it's doing is it's changing the persistence of this weather. And this is a feature that we feel in Manitoba a lot. This circulation of this pattern is slowing down. So when you drag that weather over top of an area, it lasts for a longer period of time. So you get a persistence of a warm air mass for a long time. You get a persistence of a cold air mass for a long time. You also get the persistence of a wet air mass for a long time, which leads to floods. You get a persistence of a dry air mass, which leads to droughts. And so this persistence is a phenomenon that we think is connected between the high Arctic and the more temperate parts of the planet. And this is called a teleconnection. And we're still working out the details of this, but there are many examples of how this works statistically. We're now trying to work on the physics of how this process works to understand it from a climate perspective. So in closing, the cryosphere is responding as expected. They don't want me to move at all. My mic even goes crazy if I do that. The cryosphere is responding as expected. We predicted these things about 25, 30 years ago, and they're starting to happen. The models, unfortunately, are very conservative relative to what we're observing. To give you an idea, the Greenland ice sheet is losing mass 600% faster than the models predict. We're losing sea ice in the high Arctic about 40% faster than the models predict. We're losing permafrost about 40% faster than the models predict. So the models are all conservative relative to observations. Complex interactions through space and time, not the same thing as happening in the same place. So when somebody tells you that the sea ice is all disappearing and therefore polar bear habitat is all disappearing, you can tell them that Barbara says, no, that's not true. Some places it's getting better, other places it's getting worse, and it's complicated. There's lots of complexity in it. There's impacts throughout the system. We haven't found anything yet, right from viruses and bacteria right up through the food chain to the highest trophic levels. Everything is being affected by this change in sea ice. Everything is happening faster than expected. And one of the key things is that industry is really looking at the Arctic as a third ocean to develop. You know, think about our history in Canada. We've developed the Pacific Ocean, we've developed the Atlantic Ocean, we're now wanting to develop the Arctic Ocean. There's a lot of resources in the Arctic Ocean, there's a lot of capability with transcontinental shipping, a lot of capability with intercontinental shipping. And these things are really making it complicated for us in the scientific world to understand what are the relative contributions of industrial development versus those of climate change on the system. We don't understand exactly what's happening with the system yet, and if you superimpose upon it industrial kinds of activities, it makes it even more difficult to figure out. A little bit of a note here about what we're doing right now. We just received a $32 million grant to build a new marine research base right here at the northern tip of Cape Mary. This is Churchill. This is the port of Churchill. So we bring the Amundsen into here when we're doing research work in the high Arctic. And this facility will be built right here, and it's specifically designed to look at oil spills in sea ice. So we're interested in understanding what happens if you have a spill from an exploratory drilling platform, or if you had a tanker that is, transiting across the Arctic and it runs into an iceberg and it spills its content. We want to understand how to detect it, how to look at its impacts, and how to mitigate it. And thankfully, we have some time to do this now that fracking has created this $40 a barrel oil, but 3 or 4 years ago, we were very concerned that the industry was going to be way ahead of us and we weren't going to have a chance to get the science in place, but I think we will now get the science in place. This is what the main facility will look like. It'll have a couple of pools, which are mesocosms. We can actually bring salt water in from the estuary, fill both of the pools. We can have a whole ecosystem in them, and we can do experiments on both contaminated and uncontaminated sides of the system. So thanks for your attention. You can find me at that address there, and I'll be looking forward to participating in questions later on. Thanks.
How are we doing? There we go. Let's see if I can find this here. Thank you, David. Okay. There we go. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of some of these changes on northern communities and people who rely on the sea ice. We heard a fair bit about some of the impacts both globally and locally on the systems. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts on northern communities and people who live in the north. You know, we talk a lot about polar bears, we talk a lot about belugas and other animals, and that's important to do. But we often forget about this particular species, one that also inhabits the Arctic, and about 100,000 or so people that live in Canada's Arctic, who rely on the sea ice and whose lives are really inextricably connected to the sea ice. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think the best way to understand what the impacts of some of these changes on people in the north is to understand how they rely on the sea ice and what the sea ice means to them. There we go. So in Nunavut there are about 25 communities ranging from Iqaluit down in the bottom there, maybe 7,500 people or so, 8,000 or so, to the smallest, which is the upper right, Grise Fjord, of about 130 people. And in the middle are communities like Pond Inlet of around 2,000 people or so. And these communities are isolated communities. There's no roads going in and out. There are airstrips and planes can land. But as far as getting supplies into these communities for dry goods and non-perishable items, things like that, there's a sea lift. And this comes once a year. And so if your washing machine happens to break just after the sea lift leaves, well, you got a year to wash your clothes by hand, I suppose. So what that means is a few things. That's actually a $23.30 jar of Cheese Whiz. I've seen it as high as $29 in the north. And the reason I'm pointing this out is two things. One is the things are expensive. It's difficult to get good food in the north at an affordable kind of a price. But it's also the kind of food. So I don't know what bothers me more, the fact that it's $23 or the fact that it's Cheese Whiz, to be perfectly honest. But this is the kind of stuff that can survive over a year's time in a shipping container waiting to go out on the shelves. And it is difficult to get good nutrition in the north. This is why a good well-stocked pantry tends to look something like this. People rely quite a bit on country foods, local foods that they can hunt locally for their nutrition, and it is an important part of nutrition in the north. So hunting is important. We'll talk about what that means in relation to sea ice in a minute. So as far as sea ice goes, sometimes people will say to me, you know, gosh, these communities are isolated as it is, and then this sea ice freezes all around them, and they must feel really isolated and closed off from everything else. And really, it's just the opposite. This is the beach at Tuktoyaktuk. You're looking out sort of towards Russia, and at newly forming sea ice, this is November. And really, when that sea ice forms, that's your ticket to be able to move around, because the sea ice is your highway. That's how you get around. That's how you travel by skidoo, by snowmobile. That's how you do your hunting and provide for your family. That's how you visit other communities next door, maybe a couple 100 kilometers away or so. So the sea ice is a really important highway for getting out and traveling in the north for these communities. It's also important socially and culturally. This is actually a fiddle concert on an iceberg that's trapped in the sea ice just off Pond Inlet. And so the sea ice is important also for cultural and social well-being in the north too. So I don't need to go into all the changes in sea ice. You've heard a fair bit about that, and you can begin to understand how these changes can begin to impact some of these communities. Other impacts as well that are less direct, but potentially very important too. Increased shipping as the sea ice freezes later and thaws earlier. The opportunities for increased ship traffic are certainly there, and we're starting to see that. Increased interest in resource extraction as well. This is the Mary River mine. It's not too far from Pond Inlet and Arctic Bay. And this mine just recently proposed to bring ships in through and past Pond Inlet for about 10 months of the year. So they'll be breaking ice and doing it at almost every day and a half with a ship coming through right past Pond Inlet. Well, you might say, well, that's potentially some really good economic opportunities for the community, and it is. I know various people who work at the mine, actually. But there are other instances where there's some concern within the community. So remember, I was talking about sea ice being a highway and how you get around. So now you could imagine a ship breaking ice every couple days, passing by the community. It'd be sort of like taking the Lionsgate Bridge down for a brief period of time. It can really impact the way one travels, and I'll give you an example of that. So up on the left there, what you're looking at are two communities. Let's see, is that pointer here? Let's see if this works. Yeah, there we go. So Nain and Voisey's Bay, just there. Those two communities. And the blue lines are actual travel routes. So you'll notice the travel routes are all in the water because it's on the frozen sea ice. The thicker the blue line, the more traveled that route is. And so you can see that there's a considerable amount of travel between the two communities. There's a considerable amount of travel great distances out away from the communities as well. The thing to notice is the red lines now. Those red lines are ship tracks. That's where the ships to the mine near Voisey's Bay come and go on a regular basis. And you can see they cut right through those travel routes. For people that rely on those travel routes, that can be a real impact. And there's actually a fair bit of work going on to try and mitigate that. They're creating pontoons and all kinds of things to try and pontoon bridges to try and cross these ship tracks and things like that. So there are impacts that we may not necessarily be able to see right away that are indirect impacts. And I just wanted to take about 5 or 10 minutes to kind of go through that, and then we'll talk some more and answer any questions in the dialogue to follow. So I'm going to stop it there.
Can you all hear me? Yeah, good. So that's great. Dave and Eric gave a great background on ice loss and what is happening with the communities and the ice up north. And I am going to zone into one species, and that is the beluga whale, an iconic Arctic species that I've been studying since 2002. I started here at the Aquarium and then moved my studies to the St. Lawrence and Hudson Bay, and in later years the Arctic, Cunningham Inlet. And most of my studies have been centered around acoustic communication because sound to these whales is everything. They rely on sound to navigate, to communicate with each other, to maintain social contact in a world that is dark and turbid. When there's noise in this system, this social contact can get disturbed. So understanding what the impacts of noise on acoustic communication are is very important. First, a brief overview of what the loss of ice means for the species more generally. So again, there's reduced food sources. Dave mentioned the algae that grows underneath the ice, and that really is the foundation of the Arctic food chain. Less ice means less of this algae, and it means less available prey for the belugas. Other marine mammals are slowly moving north because there is more access, essentially, and so there's more competition for prey. There's also a shift in the distribution of prey. There's fish that are coming from the south, and they're bringing with them higher levels of PCBs and mercury, and belugas are feeding on these fish and becoming more polluted. And there's the ice used to form a very good barrier to parasites and disease, to pathogens, essentially. And there's now a reduced barrier. And so, for instance, scientists in the past few years have found that belugas that are being hunted in the Beaufort Sea, 1 out of 10 belugas carries a parasite called toxoplasmosis, and that parasite can actually affect humans. So it can affect hunters, beluga hunters, that if the meat is not cured properly. There's a shift in the distribution of the whales themselves. So with receding ice, the whales move farther and farther from shore, and this has been found along the west coast of Greenland, for example, where then hunters have less access to the whales, and as Eric mentioned, whales are a fundamental aspect of the lives of northern communities, whales and seals and nutritional resources, essentially. And there's an increased threat of predation. With shifting ice, there's more possibilities for belugas to get trapped underneath shifty ice. And so to avoid exhaustion and to avoid dying of suffocation, essentially, they congregate on very small ice holes, and they cannot leave these ice holes, and they become sitting ducks for polar bears. Killer whales are also a predator of belugas, and they have been sighted with in much increasing rates in Hudson Bay. But most importantly, there's increased human access. Humans are accessing areas that were completely inaccessible in the past. And so this has resulted in increased shipping, increased tourism, increased industry. And this brings about pollution from human activities, and most importantly, for a species that is acoustic, noise pollution. So this increased exposure to underwater noise for belugas means the following. I'm going to play a little clip of what the underwater world of a beluga whale sounds in the absence of noise. So this was actually a recording in 2008 in the St. Lawrence River estuary. It was a herd of males very early in the morning. There were no boats around. And just a couple of hours later, following the same herd of young males, the area had become very busy with tourism and ferry traffic, and this is what you could hear. Now imagine you're a beluga trying to communicate in this noise. So it's a pretty dire situation. Now there is, at the north end of Somerset Island, an estuary called Cunningham Inlet, where about 2,000 belugas every summer from the eastern high Arctic Baffin Bay population bring their calves to nurse, to socialize, to play. It presumably helps with skin molting as well. And this is a pristine nursery with absolutely no boats around and no industry of any kind just yet. The only noise that you can hear is that of the wind. This video was taken in 2014 from my research tower in Cunningham Inlet. You can see that a lot of these whales have a calf with this. So this is a beluga nursery, stammering ground. And the Vancouver Aquarium, in association with the Arctic Watch Beluga Foundation, started a project in 2014 that continued on last summer and will hopefully continue next year in this area in Cunningham Inlet to provide a baseline that we can use to compare the effects of noise on the communication and behavior of the species in the future in areas affected by the noise brought about by development projects. And at the center of this study are critical contact calls. This is one of the most, if you're trying to understand anything about the vocal repertoire of a species that is pretty much as loquacious as humans, you need to focus on what the calls that are just absolutely key for survival and that you can understand are. And these are contact calls. We identified them in 2002 at the Vancouver Aquarium. They are key for group cohesion and to maintain contact between mothers and calves. This is an example of broadband contact calls recorded in Cunningham Inlet last season. So you probably all can tell that these calls sound really very, very different than the typical chirp and whistly repertoire of beluga whales. And this is typical of contact calls in all the species for which this call type has been studied. They can be picked out of, from the species background chatter. They sound really very different than the rest of the repertoire. They are stereotyped and repeated. And in the case of beluga contact calls, they are very broadband and they have energy at very high frequencies. You can see there how the call extends all the way to the limit of the recording system, 125 kilohertz. So very, very broadband calls. Now, I used, again, a very broadband calibrated hydrophone to do my recordings, and I accompanied this with behavioral observations on an iPad. And the research tower was key initially, especially in 2014. It allowed us to get a better view of the whales. We would access this tower at low tide, and then slowly you would get surrounded by water and whales. Now, the problem was the sheer amount of whales in the inlet. All of those little white dots are beluga whales, and that red circle is the research tower. So when you're trying to infer anything about the acoustic system of a species that surrounds you by the hundreds, identifying who you're recording becomes very, very difficult. So we can tell general things like, okay, contact calls are very important to this population. In fact, 10% of the repertoire consisted of contact calls in 2014. I was very lucky that a sort of ideal natural experiment was handed to me by nature. The whales would periodically, this happened often, get entrapped in these canals and sandbars at low tide, and sandbars would act as sound barriers, and slowly the tide would rise and the whales would be able to leave the area, not in any major rush. So it didn't look like the whales were in any danger in these entrapments. In fact, they may have gone into these river canals for a reason. But the fact is, I could identify the group that I was recording, and group composition was estimated with the help of a GoPro attached to the end of a very long pole, so it allowed us to look down into the water. And we also borrowed some footage opportunistically from a film crew, which really made us realize how ideal drones are to assess group composition from above. And these situations provided essentially uniform variables. So the hydrophone was always at the same depth. We pretty much had the same distance from the whales, same situation and same behavior. And under these circumstances, in these isolation events that happened over and over, the whales would produce almost exclusively contact calls. So you're hearing a contact call exchange. They're all keeping track of one another using these calls. So again, very, very different than the typical repertoire of beluga whales. And the fact that they use contact calls in these entrapments and that we could really determine group composition, and without a doubt, we knew that we were not recording the animals that were in the larger herd, allowed us to compare groups with little neonates to groups with no neonates. And now this brings me back to the initial research about vocal development that started here in 2002, that identified the fact that little calves are not born knowing the entire beluga whale repertoire. They need to learn it. And contact calls are acquired very slowly. And so the idea is that initially, these very low frequency, underdeveloped, essentially, contact calls that neonates produce may be more easily masked by noise, which is a problem in a melting Arctic, in an accessible Arctic, essentially. But we had to prove this. And this summer was the perfect opportunity to do so, because beautifully, 6 of these entrapments had neonates and 7 did not. And when we compare the entrapments, these very low frequency contact calls simply did not exist in the entrapments, in the isolation events that didn't have neonates with them. So you could only see the existence of these low frequency contact calls in entrapments with neonates. So that's essentially what calves sound like, and they don't actually know how to whistle or how to produce any other sound until a few weeks of age. And those the peak frequency components of the calls produced by neonate belugas overlap with the main most of the energy of boat noise, underwater vessel noise. And this is key because we can bring this knowledge to other areas that are affected by development. In fact, we've started a project farther south, not the Arctic, but still it's an Arctic species that's endangered in the St. Lawrence. Belugas there are not doing well, and calves are dying at alarming rates. And one of the reasons is suggested to be mother-calf separation occurring because of noise. So we're testing whether noise indeed is masking these very low frequency contact calls that calves that are vital for calves to maintain acoustic contact with their mothers. And we will also, we hope to move this study to places like Churchill, where looking at the rate of use and parameters of these known vocalizations can tell us a lot about how whales respond acoustically and behaviorally to disturbances. So thank you, and like Dave and Eric, I'm happy to answer any questions and looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you very much. So I'd like to go ahead and invite our panelists, to our speakers, to come on up. We have some chairs here we're going to set up. We may not be quick on the draw here, but yeah, we'll just bring these out here and set them right here. Right, and why don't we move the chairs forward just a bit so we can avoid some feedback. Yeah, just bring it up a little bit further. Perfect. Okay, how's that? Not going to work? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have to pass this microphone just because we have a speaker behind you and we're going to get some feedback with your mic. So we're going to pass this microphone back and forth. I just wanted to open up. So thank you very much for your presentations today. I think I learned more about sea ice today than I ever have before in my life. The ice algae that grows on the bottom of the sea ice, Dave, can you just remind me that we get sea ice on multi-year, we get sea algae or ice algae on the sea ice that's multi-year, correct? And what influences that ice algae is the thickness of the snow layer on top of the multi-year ice, is that correct?
Not quite.
Okay, so can you
Not
fix
quite.
that?
Typically, ice algae grows on the bottom of first-year sea ice. You do get ice-adapted algae on multi-year ice as well, but it's a different mixture of algae that grows on it, and it's not really a big part of the marine ecosystem. There's a lot of complexity in that story as well. Like, sure, you get ice-adapted algae, and that triggers the ecosystem. But as you reduce the sea ice, you get a lot more ice edges, and ice edges are very productive places because you get wind-driven upwelling along ice edges, so you get a lot of pelagic algae growth in those areas as well. So we're not actually sure whether, as you reduce the amount of ice cover in the Arctic, will you actually decrease the amount of biomass at that primary level, or will you increase it? We don't know the answer to that yet.
Okay, so for somebody who doesn't know a whole lot about the Arctic, obviously that could be me. Is this a problem? If the sea ice is being reduced and is possibly causing an increase in productivity in the pelagic area, should that be considered a problem, or is that a benefit to the Arctic ecosystem? And what kind of transformation or change will we see? You'd mentioned a shift. What kind of shift could we see?
Okay. Well, it's very complicated, first of all, and it's spatially variable. So depending on where you are and when you are, things are much different. So I'll start at the pole. So recently we had a number of research vessels internationally that went right to the pole. And one of the issues they found right at the pole was there wasn't enough strong ice to stand on, so you couldn't put teams out on the ice. But interestingly, when you put ROVs under the ice, we were finding a tremendous amount of biological productivity from the base of the ice right down to the benthos, right at the North Pole. And so the question becomes well, how do you get enough nutrients to promote that amount of biomass right at the North Pole? There shouldn't be any upwelling because there is an ice sheet there, even though it's deteriorated so you can't stand on it. And so there's some uncertainty as to what's happening with advection of nutrients in the Arctic. We don't quite understand how the nutrients become available in some areas where there aren't the traditional upwelling kind of features at ice edges and things. As you start to move further south, we're getting a very strong bloom under the ice in summer. There was a paper that Kevin Arrigo did a few years back that was showing things that we've been seeing in the archipelago for many years before that, where the biological productivity was very strong right through, like we call the pelagic layer of the ocean beneath. So if you think the sea ice is up there, it's actually the entire water column is becoming very productive. And this is a positive thing in the sense that it stimulates the Arctic. But the problem then is the other trophic levels don't necessarily have the appropriate timing or biomass to take advantage of all that. So the Arctic has evolved for a long period of time to take advantage of a pattern of this productivity and the timing of this productivity and where it is. So you could have a tremendous amount of productivity, but if there's nothing there to eat it, then you don't transfer that energy up the system. And that's one of the problems is the mismatch of different trophic levels in the system. And it happens all over the place in the Arctic, and it's highly variable and becoming more so as the ice dynamics change.
And a question that I wanted to present to all of our speakers tonight is, a lot of times when we talk about time and we talk about animals and how things change over time and adaptation and how animals can adapt to changes, how do you think animals or people will be able to adapt to some of the changes that we're starting to see in the Arctic? You mentioned a few things in your presentations, but just kind of, just key points and are animals going to be able to adapt in time? Are there specific animals that can adapt? And how does that affect people and communities? How are the adaptations? How are they prepared to adapt to changes? Start with you, Eric.
Okay, well, I will. I'll stick with my theme and continue to talk about people in the north then. You know, I was speaking with an elder in Joy Haven, and he said something that really affected me. He said, you know, I've got tremendous knowledge of the sea ice, and I can predict things, and I can understand where it's safe and where it's not safe. He said, but I feel like my knowledge is becoming obsolete. I feel like it's more difficult for me now to predict the sea ice, to understand it, to travel on it. And he was clearly very sad to be seeing his knowledge, his skill set becoming less and less relevant. So how will people adapt to that? It's a difficult question. People are changing where they're hunting. People are changing when and how they travel. They're traveling at different times. People are making the best of what they can, and it's shortening up some of the travel season for sure. But that's what people, I guess, buying more boats. Besides that is.
One thing I would say is that belugas are traditionalists. They're very set on their ways. They're animals that pass on the knowledge of the areas where they navigate, and they take their young to future generations that in turn bring their young to those same areas. So if those areas become busy with human traffic, for example, with shipping traffic, or industry or development of any kind, the whales, I don't think they have the option to adapt and move to other areas. They will stick to that area and put up with the noise. That's something that's very important to know. In terms of other species, we're already seeing a change in the distribution and abundance of species. You know, seals are moving north. Minke whales are moving north. So animals, we're seeing them right now adapting to the loss of ice and expanding their ranges. For example, killer whales being sighted in Hudson Bay in higher numbers than ever.
I guess the one that people are probably interested in is polar bears and what polar bears are doing, so I'll talk a little bit about that one. You all know that polar bears tend to go on land in the summertime when there's no ice to hunt on, and they have to fast mostly while they're on land, so they do manage to scavenge a little bit of stuff, but not much. And this is an issue in the southern populations in particular, but it's starting to become an issue in the southern Beaufort Sea population in particular because of what's happening with the Pacific sector of the sea ice. So to give you an idea, this summer the Amundsen was operating just off of McClure Strait, and I had a group on board, and they got a hold of me saying there was 3 bears that were trying to attack the rosette. The rosette is a big instrument that we put off the side of the ship to go down, and they were attacking the rosette. It was a mother and 2 cubs, and they were 300 miles from the nearest sea ice and 300 miles from the nearest shore. But that's why we call them marine mammals. I mean, bears are perfectly comfortable in open water. The problem is they can't hunt in open water. They can't forage in open water, but they can sure travel large distances. In the last interglacial that we had, polar bears existed, and they existed at a time when we had less sea ice than we have today. So most likely the bears that are in these places where they have to summer on land, we expect they're going to move north. They don't appear to be doing that in the Hudson Bay population yet, but we're thinking that should be happening pretty soon, that they should start to move further north. So the summer refuge of sea ice is an important part to them. But I think they're quite adaptable in the sense of being able to stay in open water or on land for periods of time. If that amount of time gets to be too long, then you run into an energetics problem, and the bears are going to suffer from a population perspective for it.
And you had mentioned that the bears prefer habitat like first year ice, and we're actually seeing an increase in the amount of first-year ice in the Arctic, correct? So is there a general consensus? You had mentioned that there are specific subpopulations of polar bears. Some are doing better, some are increasing, some are declining. Is there an average, or does it not make sense to talk about an average, what's happening with polar bears?
No, I don't like talking about an average with polar bears at all. And the reason I don't like that is because first-year ice we're increasing the area that is covered by first-year sea ice. But what you have to do with first-year ice is you have to put it under pressure. So you have to pressure that ice, and it forms a ridge of some sort. And then ring seals are able to, clean out an area in that ridge area because it's soft, and then they'll make a layer in there on the downwind side of the ridge where the snow accumulates on the downwind side, and this is where they have their pups in the winter, and this is the primary habitat for polar bears, so that's what they're looking for. And so if you have more first-year ice, you have a probability of having more of that kind of ice. But there's lots of complexities in that. If you don't form the ice until very late in the season, if the ring seal pups can't be born in an ice environment where they're protected from the cold, then the increased mortality of the ring seal happens. And so that part of the system, the prey side of it, falls down. So it's a very complicated thing. And I'm disappointed, I guess, or concerned is maybe a better word. There are moves afoot to try to, for instance, put the ring seal on the endangered species list, to put the polar bear on the endangered species list. And they're using, as evidence for this, model projections of what sea ice is going to look like 10 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now. Well, I can tell you that there isn't a single sea ice model out there that will predict the ridging of first-year sea ice. There isn't a single model out there that will predict the snowfall that's associated with that ice. Yet they're trying to use these models to say this is the main evidence we have that that habitat will come under stress, and therefore we need to be proactive and put these on the endangered species list. And I've been quite vocal in the community about that, and it's contentious because people want to do the right thing. Well, the right thing is to understand the science well enough and be able to predict it well enough and then make decisions. Now, you don't have to have a perfect understanding of it. There's always risk associated with these things, but I don't think we're at the stage where we can make those decisions yet scientifically.
Okay, I do want to open it up for questions from the audience as well. So feel free to raise your hands up, and then I'll pop on over. Actually, you know what I'd like to do, since we need to leave the microphone down here, is if you could ask your question, then I'll ask our speakers if the first one that takes the question, if you could please repeat it for everybody so everyone hears it. That would be great. Okay, so let's start right over here.
I think this is for Dave. The study that NASA released last month, or a few weeks ago, about the mass of ice increasing in the Antarctic. Can you elaborate or explain that phenomenon and what it could look like for if the trend continues over the next few decades, what Earth could potentially look like? And then I had a second question for Eric about what kind of efforts are going towards increasing the food security for local people, having access to fresh foods. Are they doing any greenhouse growing? Are they doing any kinds of indoor agriculture?
Okay, so I'm going to try to paraphrase the first question, but I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at. You're talking about the Antarctic, and you're talking about a NASA study that was just released about ice mass that is breaking off the Greenland ice sheet, so it's glacial ice, or you're talking about sea ice increase in the Antarctic?
The mass of the sea ice increasing in the Antarctic.
Sea ice increasing in the Antarctic, okay. So one of the perplexing things in the sort of the contrast of the two poles is that we're losing sea ice at a very rapid rate in the Arctic, and we're increasing the amount of sea ice in the Antarctic. In the Arctic, we're losing mass from the glacial ice sheets, and in the Antarctic, we're losing mass from the glacial ice sheets. So there's a confusion there. Why are we not losing sea ice in the Antarctic? The scientific information on this is still in the process of being figured out, but I can tell you what the theories are for why that is occurring. The Antarctic is a continent surrounded by an ocean. The Arctic is an ocean surrounded by continents. So the system is just diametrically opposed with one another. The continent in the Antarctic is covered by a very large ice sheet, which is extremely cold, and it controls the local circulation and temperature of the Antarctic because it's such a dominant mass of glacial ice. And what is happening as we lose ice from that sheet into the water column into the marine system, it's actually slowing down the circulation of the ice, which allows it to consolidate more efficiently. So the way ice grows is if you're moving it very quickly, you can't grow it very much because it's continually moving and it tends to erode because of the water column. There's getting to be a lot of glacial pieces that are coming off the big ice sheets in the Antarctic that are slowing down this circulation. There's also a lot of fresh water coming off of this system, and the freezing point of fresh water is higher than the freezing point of salt water. So if you try to freeze salt water, you got to go to about minus 1.8 degrees Celsius, and of course for fresh water it's 0. So that amount of fresh water that's coming to into the system is also promoting the growth of that sea ice. So these are the main reasons why we see the sea ice in the Antarctic increasing and not decreasing like we see in the Arctic. But the main driver for that is this idea that the continent is in the center of that system in the Antarctic, and it's an ocean in the center of our system in the Arctic. And that ocean system, when you get rid of the ice cover, it now absorbs all the sunlight. So there's a very strong feedback that pushes things even more. In the Antarctic, that whole big ice sheet stays in place. It has a very high albedo, so that sunlight doesn't have nearly the effect it had as it does in the Arctic.
Okay. And your question was, what's being done to increase food security in the North in the face of some of these changes, right? Well, the first thing is there isn't an easy answer yet. There's a food subsidy program that's been in place for a while now. You asked about greenhouses. There are a couple greenhouses in a few different communities and interest in creating more greenhouses. Also keep in mind that when it comes to country foods, there's also caribou and muskox. We're seeing, for instance, increases of muskox in various areas. Caribou are still decreasing for the most part. But there isn't a real easy answer that I can give you in terms of what's really happening to increase food security. It's a great question, and a lot of people in the North are asking the same thing.
I've been up in the Arctic a few times, about 4 times, and I have seen on some patches of snow and on top of ice red algae. Who eats it? Is it insects or something else that was his purpose?
Who eats it? Oh, that's a good one, yeah. Yeah, there is algae on top of sea ice, and it forms in melt ponds and things. And usually it's cells that migrate up through the ice early in the year, and they get to the surface, and they get a lot of photosynthesis. And so, it will get scavenged mostly by birds, would be the main ones that use it. It's not thought of as a real significant food source. It actually plays a bigger role in surface albedo because it reduces the albedo, makes it more absorptive, so it tends to melt the ice more quickly. But it also seems to be increasing. And it's probably because the ice is thinner than it used to be, so the cells can migrate much more efficiently to get up to the surface. And then once they get there, they get enough light and they can start to take off. We don't know much about it beyond that, though. Yeah. Well. Sorry, I forgot to rephrase the question, but anyway, people got it.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. One, Eric, as an adaptation response, like up north for the travel routes versus the local routes, like here, it's very clear, partly because we're on land and just the nature of the governance models here, that the province owns highways. Is there any thought looking to demarcating local routes and travel routes, or because who owns what? What's the jurisdiction mess up there?
Mess is a good way to put it. So the question was,
an adaptation response is potential adaptation response to maintaining local travel routes.
Okay.
Local routes,
So
tooling of the governance model for transportation.
is there okay? So is there an adaptation response to maintaining travel routes? There's a few things in terms of adaptation. One, with regards to ship traffic and ice breaking channels, particularly with mining, is actually they're deploying these pontoon bridges as a method to try and mitigate. How successful it is another question. The community of Nain and Voisey's Bay could probably tell you a lot more about how successful that is. There are a number of efforts right now trying locally to map and monitor and measure sea ice conditions as well for safe travel around the communities. And David, I think you've been involved in some of those as well. And as far as whose jurisdiction, I'm not sure I can answer it with regards to the travel routes that way. There's certainly been a few studies looking specifically at land use, and when I say land, I mean the sea ice as well, to try and understand some of that and come up with maps like the one that I showed you. But that's what we have at the moment.
I'll just add a little bit of that. It's interesting that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is the main vehicle that is being used to look at, who owns what piece of the Arctic. And just recently, they've brought into play the idea of sea ice as a transportation corridor to extend the continental margins in areas where there's disputes. So the Northwest Passage, for instance, right now, the Americans think of it as an international waterway because it's wide enough to come under the umbrella of that international waterway clause. But if you include the sea ice and the transportation corridors that the Inuit have historically used along the Northwest Passage route, it's not. And so it's an interesting legal challenge to that by saying we can show historically that the Inuit have used this as an extension of the territorial, what you think of as the normal landmass that you are responsible for as a nation. So if that holds up in that court, then that would mean that that would be used as a primary argument for the Northwest Passage being an interior waterway for Canada and not an international waterway.
Someone else? Okay, go ahead.
If you could just expand on, again, how does noise stress belugas? Is it the exposure? Is it thresholds? And does it come at like long-term exposure, or is it mostly their weak point is at calf and mother separation?
Sure. So the question is, how does noise stress belugas? Is it long-term? Is it punctual? Does it just have to do with mother-calf separation? And there's many aspects to the influence of noise. I just watched a really good Nature of Things documentary on noise and humans, which really made a really good point. It showed a bunch of humans in a very noisy city that were tested for increased levels of stress. And it was found that indeed noise, the persistent influence of noise on humans creates stress. So that's one of the aspects for beluga whales. You take belugas out of a pristine area where they're not facing constant noise, and you introduce noise that constantly interferes not just with the ability of mothers and calves to communicate with one another, but with the ability of the group to maintain cohesion, and with echolocation. These animals find their food through sound, and noise interferes with their echolocation signals. And so, of course, you increase, presumably, their level of stress. You can also take away time that they would put into activities such as finding food, because they would presumably try and go into avoidance reactions, and try and leave those sources of noise a little further behind. So they move away from an area and come back to it to forage, and that takes energy. The reason that I'm focusing on mother-calf contact is that the consequences of severing that bond are critical to calves. And another reason is that we basically understand what we're looking at. We know very, very little about the repertoire of sounds that beluga whales produce, and yet sounds are absolutely everything. Like understand anything about the effects of noise on their communication and behavior, we need to understand the function of the sounds that we're looking at. And for contact calls, we know what the function is. And so this is one of the reasons. It's not that noise isn't impacting other sounds in the repertoire. It is that we know what to look for when we look at contact calls.
Any other questions?
I'm really curious about like invasive species and what that means in the Arctic. And my other question is about Aboriginal communities and how they're impacted by heavy mining and oil industry up there.
So I'll maybe try to take the first question, which was about invasive species and sort of what the effect they're having on the marine ecosystem in the Arctic. Yeah, okay, well, there's lots of them, and they're pretty much everything you can think of throughout the trophic levels. So we're getting invasive species at the algal side of things, to a certain extent at the zooplankton edges of things, in the vertebrates for the fishes. There's various invasives there, and then there's other predators that typically wouldn't come in, like the killer whales are starting to be seen more often now in the Arctic, and they're all basically they're coming in because there is an extension of their natural range. So we call it the Atlantification of the Arctic. So when you get to the Atlantic side of the Arctic, it's basically the characteristics of the Atlantic Ocean are spreading further north. So when I showed you that image of the ice melting because of the Atlantic layer coming up and melting the underside of the ice, it's basically extending the range of the Atlantic Ocean further into the Arctic. The same is happening on the Pacific side. We're getting a Pacification of the Arctic on the Pacific side, which is doing the same thing. And the same is happening in Hudson Bay. So for instance, the Arctic cod used to be a common mid-level trophic species, and it's been replaced now by the capelin, which is more of an Atlantic species. And so it's happening all over the place, and it's at the margins of the Arctic right now. So where it happens, the Arctic food chain is being displaced slightly because of these encroachments of these other species. The Inuit notice it. They're starting to catch different kinds of fish in the Pacific or in the Beaufort Sea that are coming in from the Pacific. There are Pacific herring, for instance, that spawn under the sea ice in the Eskimo Lakes area, which is just south of Tuktoyaktuk. Have been for a long time, but they're starting to become more prevalent there. They're more pronounced there. And there's a lot of concern and interest in commercial exploitation of these species. If you start to get the Atlantification of the Arctic, does that mean that you get commercial fisheries starting to develop in the high Arctic? And how are we going to manage those things, and how are we going to monitor them, and the complexities of part of the ocean where people push the margins of these commercially viable species? So have you ever seen that show about how they do the crab fishery in the Bering Strait and getting out amongst the ice and trying to get these very valuable fisheries crops? This is a big concern in the Arctic because it's we don't know what the population levels are for some of these species, whether they are commercially viable or not, and then it's just the problem of the industrialization, all that increased traffic and all that activity. I think a good way to think about the Arctic is that it is being industrialized. We're industrializing the Arctic many different ways: fisheries, oil and gas exploration, marine shipping, mining, all those kind of things.
And the second part of your question was how resource extraction and these kinds of things are impacting communities, right? People, yeah. Well, a couple things to note. One is there's no oil and gas exploration in the Canadian Arctic at the moment. And that's because they're currently required by the National Energy Board to be able to drill a relief well within the same season in case there's a blowout, and the technology just isn't there to do that in the short drilling season in the Arctic. They're certainly lobbying to have that requirement removed, but that's currently the situation as far as oil and gas goes in the Canadian Arctic anyway. As far as other resource extraction, there's quite a bit of mining. Iron, diamonds are two of the biggie, and that's a mixed sort of thing for a lot of these communities. It can be a divisive issue for some of these communities because there's the economic benefits that come from that, and they're real, and people in the community of Pond Inlet, for instance, several people are employed by the Mary River Mine and able to work for 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, that sort of thing. And so there's certain benefits that way. It's divisive because it's also a situation where the environmental impacts are not well understood. What are the impacts of bringing ships in on a regular basis? What are the impacts of the noise on marine mammals, for example? What happens if there's an accident? These kinds of things. And so it can be divisive within a community, but the impacts there's positive and there's potential negatives.
We're covered, okay. Okay, so I think what I'd like to do is go ahead and wrap it up. Some great questions from our audience. Thank you very much. And I'd love to be able to distill things down so that I could say one thing. And I think the only thing I can think of right now is that if you're asking somebody about what's going on in the Arctic and whether or not these changes are good or bad, the answer is it's complicated. And you can't just say it's good or it's bad, because depending on what exactly you're talking about, there are some, you may see it through a good lens, you may see it through a bad lens. So anyone who tries to oversimplify what's going on in the Arctic is probably being a little bit possibly foolish, or not thinking it all the way through. So perhaps one thing that we can do is when we're listening to folks talking about what's going on in the Arctic, we can be very critical about how simple they're trying to make the issues there. Okay, so I would like to thank all of our speakers for coming tonight. Valeria, Dave, you've come quite a ways, and Eric, thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank all of you tonight as well. I would also like to thank our sponsors for supporting the Canadian Association of Science Centers and the W. Gordon Weston Foundation. The Vancouver Aquarium is a nonprofit science organization, so if you'd like to support the aquarium, our programs, Valeria's work, Eric's work, you can make a donation to the aquarium by going to www.vanaqua.org. So thank you very much and have a good night.